But to evaluate Bitcoin from that perspective is to do it self-interestedly. And we didn't want to write a book where people would evaluate it self-interestedly. There are enough of those books. We wanted to argue that Bitcoin was good for the world. And that means overall, the world is better for having Bitcoin in it than the exact same world would be without Bitcoin. One way to figure that out is to think, if you could have been anyone in the world, would you want a Bitcoin world?
Right, we're rolling. Today, very excited to be joined by BPI's very own ABC. We got the authors of Resistance, Money, a philosophical case for Bitcoin with us today, and we're gonna dig into it. So, just to get us started, curious y'all's connection to BPI. What's the origin story? I think gonna go first to Andrew here. When and why did you become a BPI fellow?
There are a number of academics who are interested in Bitcoin, and an appreciable fraction of them were active on Twitter, let's say from 2020 until 2021, 2022. And David Zell started to find a few of us, and I don't remember when exactly it was, but it was before BPI formed. We had several conversations about some way of getting these academics together in a more formal way. And we threw around ideas for what that organization might do and what it might be called. And eventually that became BPI. And I was invited to join as a fellow initially and asked who else should be involved. Of course, Brad and Craig were also invited at the same time. We do all things together. And we're very happy to see some of our other academic friends get involved from that early stage. People like Will Luther, the economist, who's written more about Bitcoin than anybody else.
Yeah. No, Will's a killer. We always like to hear what he has to say. Okay, shifting over to Bradley. What did your work look like before BPI, and how has that kind of shifted to modern times?
We started being fellows at BPI shortly after, I think, our first academic papers on cryptocurrency came out. Or shortly after we drafted them. And we were kind of wondering what we would do next. And we suspected that we would write a book and that it would be about Bitcoin. And becoming BPI fellows just sort of cemented that that was going to be the next big intellectual academic project that the three of us took on together. But in addition to that, there's only so much you can bang your head against a project when you're working on it before you need to take a break and do something else. And so right away after becoming a BPI fellow, all of those taking a break times from my serious academic work, I would start drafting op-eds or something like that with the idea that it would be good for BPI if we placed those in newspapers or magazines or on the blog or whatever. And the longer we kept going with BPI and the more people joined and the more momentum, the more of my day those things took up and became not just the extra time, but a focus of my research time. And I find it really enjoyable writing for non-academic audiences. I like the breezy way that you can write and how you don't have to nitpick everything and cite everything, and much more small digestible chunks. And so, yeah, just Bitcoin work took over more and more of my academic research time as time went on.
Sweet. Yeah, it's definitely fun to branch out to, even on other things. So, all right, Craig, let's round us out here. What does it mean to be a part of BPI? What does being a BPI fellow / researcher look like? Yeah.
So, as Brad mentioned, I don't think prior to the formation of the Bitcoin Policy Institute that we would have said that we were 100% Bitcoin researchers. I think that's closer to true now than it was a few years ago. And the Bitcoin Policy Institute then has a lot to do with it. I think you can think about it in three different levels. So at the first level, there's the financial support that allows us to concentrate more time on Bitcoin research. And then at the second level, there's time and space and the opportunity to collaborate with other Bitcoin Policy Institute fellows. We collaborate quite a bit. I mean, not just amongst the three of us, but with other academics who are fellows with the Bitcoin Policy Institute. And then BPI also provides things like the Bitcoin Policy Summit in Washington, D.C. We just spoke at the second annual BPI Summit in D.C. Back in April. And we hope that this is going to be a perennial event. And this provides us the opportunity to discuss Bitcoin and provide truths about Bitcoin to people who are in government agencies, who serve in Congress. And so not only do we have more time to work on Bitcoin through financial support, we have more people to work with under the umbrella of BPI. And then there's a platform where we can, shoot our research through the pipeline across people who need to hear it.
Yeah, no, that's a great way of saying it. We got a lot going on with BPI, but I think another great thing is also the community around us, and we're up to I think 20 fellows now, so got a nice all-star cast. All right, sweet. So y'all see that I've got the book behind me, so we're gonna go right into that. Had to show it off today, but gonna go to Brad first. When did the idea come about to write the book? I know y'all were writing, on things that are covered in the book before, but yeah, when was it like, hey, we're gonna sit down and put this in book form?
The genesis of all of the writing of the three of us on Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies was Craig's was the earliest. So he was the first one of us doing academic work on Bitcoin. And then when we overlapped at a conference in Pittsburgh in 2019, I think, I was like, wow, I didn't know you were doing academic work on Bitcoin. I've been thinking about Bitcoin, but not very seriously and not very frequently for a while. And we started Gmail chatting, and we wrote these two papers on cryptocurrency. We had tried to pitch these papers to be on Bitcoin, and the editor countered with blockchain, and then we countered with cryptocurrency, focusing on the most important, biggest one. So it was a way to try to do as much as we could about Bitcoin, but we had to nominally make it about cryptocurrency more generally. And then we were allowed 10,000 words, and we wrote 40,000 words. And then we cut down to 25, and we asked if we could publish the 25 in like 2 articles, and they said we could publish 20 in 2 articles. So it was pretty clear that we just had so much more to say than we were able to say in the 2 papers. And they're kind of introductory papers, opinionated introductions, I guess, to especially the moral aspects of Bitcoin. And so we started thinking about what a Bitcoin book would look like, what we'd want to focus on. And then I got a grant from the University of Wyoming to bring Andrew and Craig to Wyoming for, Andrew, I think, was here 5 weeks. Craig was here 2 weeks. So Andrew and I did another project. And then when Craig got here, spent, I think, 6 hours a day for 10 days drafting the first parts of 10 of the chapters, and then just ran with it from there.
Awesome. Yeah, that's I know y'all have been kind of working on this for a while, and maybe that's not immediately obvious to the folks who are reading the book, but there's these ideas that are in there have been popping around for a while. Okay, so now I want to kind of dig into like reception of the idea. I think all of us are relatively aware that maybe the academic community is not the friendliest towards Bitcoiners. What was it like trying to get someone to stand behind you on that? What was it like, with your colleagues? I imagine there's some challenges, but yeah, what were the details on that?
I think that we had 2 sets of problems One set of problems was just we were people who had not written a book before. And so we were kind of flying by the seat of our pants, trying to figure things out. The second group of problems had to do with resistance, no pun intended, to a book that would have a positive evaluation of Bitcoin. And these two sets of problems played off each other as we were trying to find a press who would publish our book. So, for example, the first press we went to, and we only went to one press. So that was like an inexperience issue. We should have sent our proposal to a bunch of different presses at a time, so then we could get the evaluations back all at once and then choose a press. So we just picked one. We sent our proposal, and then here's the kind of obstacle we would run into with Bitcoin resistance. So we submitted the proposal, and it was fairly positive, but what we got back were comments, many of which were classic Bitcoin FUD, that we felt like, well, we would tackle these in the book. We're also happy to explain how we'll do that. And so they provided us a chance to revise the proposal and resubmit, which we did. And then they said that we should revise the proposal again and resubmit, which we did. And at that point, the press ghosted us, and we never heard back. And I did hear through back channels that in a meeting, the people who were deciding whether or not to take our book thought that our book bordered on Bitcoin boosterism. And philosophy books make cases for things all the time, and it just seemed one step too far to write a book that didn't just explain how Bitcoin worked and what consequences it might have for the world, but to have a book that would argue that Bitcoin made the world better. I don't think that they were friendly to such a book. And so at that point, we needed to widen the aperture and send the proposal to a bunch of other presses, which we did. And we did find a press, obviously, in Rutledge Press, who was amenable to the idea. Now, as far as other academics go, and especially our colleagues, I think there's just a wide range of responses. So some people would think, oh wow, like this is applied philosophy of technology, in like technology ethics, and this has really gained steam, especially with respect to AI. And so why not have a book about Bitcoin? That seems like a cool idea. Other people who might have their ear closer to someone like the comments from Elizabeth Warren about Bitcoin have been more hesitant. And I think they would think that we're automatically like libertarians or conservatives or something who are trying to push some sort of ideological argument in favor of Bitcoin, which isn't true. And then I, in particular, I think I had some colleagues who were just concerned, this was back in like 2020, 2021. And, has Craig gone off the deep end? Has he gone crazy? Is he losing his mind? And I have very kind colleagues, very, very smart. And all that took was, basically just a lunch to try to explain where it's coming from and what the book might be like.
Yeah, it sounds like persistence was the key element there. And yeah, but obviously nice to be here today and have the book behind me and behind all of you. All right, sweet. Let's dig into the details. So what does it look like to write a book for an academic audience versus a Bitcoin audience? I think all of us have seen our fair share of Bitcoin books, but what does it look like to write a Bitcoin book for academics? And Andrew, you're welcome to take that one.
I'd like to first add one more thing to what you said. You said perseverance was important here. I would add that teamwork was too. I'm not sure that any one of us alone, in fact, I'm quite sure that any one of us alone would not have persisted in the way we did. But it's always nice to have a crew to work with together, and we found that both in each other within ABC and also within the broader BPI community, that when we face these weird obstacles, there's a group chat we can grouse to and also strategize within. So I think all of us appreciate that and draw on that pretty regularly in pressing forward, despite the obstacles that Craig mentioned. There's some formal or structural things that mark a bit an academic book as separate from other kinds of books. So this includes things like having tons of footnotes, 500 sources in the bibliography, and the trappings of scholarship. So we really tried to be responsible to those kinds of academic standards when writing this book. And in that way, it sets apart from other Bitcoin books. It's really the first actual piece of research that submits to those kinds of standards, that treats Bitcoin, especially in a comprehensive way, not just as one or two chapters about Bitcoin, but really a 360-degree view of the thing from a number of disciplinary angles, looking at both theoretical and empirical facts. So that's one thing that separates Resistance Money from other kinds of Bitcoin books, is the trappings or the formal features of an academic piece of research. Maybe more subtle, but perhaps more important, is that we come to this not just as advocates, but actually as teachers. We are quite used to arguing in the classroom and being around people who disagree with us. And our goal when we're in the classroom as teachers is not typically to get students to come to our point of view. Instead, it's to get students to better understanding, to ask deeper questions, and to come into better and closer acquaintance with the relevant facts, the relevant theories, the relevant considerations, the pieces of evidence for or against the opinions they already have. So in some ways, that also sets this book apart from other Bitcoin books, because many other Bitcoin books are straightforwardly pieces of advocacy. They ask questions like, why buy Bitcoin? And then they answer, you should buy Bitcoin. And their goal isn't to help you understand, really. It's to get you to buy Bitcoin. And that might even be in the title. And that's great. If you want to read a book about why you should buy Bitcoin, you should read the book, Why Buy Bitcoin? There are other books that stem from narrow or deeply ideological perspectives, especially from the libertarian right in the American political spectrum, or even more narrowly from the Austrian School of Economics. Other factor that sets our book apart from those is that we don't really help ourselves to those kinds of controversial premises. We try to draw from perspectives and premises, basic assumptions that just about anybody can find acceptable. And maybe this is another reflection of our classroom experience and the background that we come from there, where you can't count on everybody already agreeing with you on your core foundations, but you've got to find something that you have in common. So we worked hard to do that and to give a case for Bitcoin that's fair, that's comprehensive, that really takes into account objections to Bitcoin. In fact, over 25 objections to Bitcoin are addressed in the book, and then address them not using narrow ideological premises, but premises that just about anybody can accept.
Yeah. Speaking of premises that anyone can accept, I think this leads nicely into the next question that I have, which is surrounding the sort of framing device here that's used, which is the veil of ignorance. Maybe a little nod to John Rawls's original position. Can we dig into that? Craig, do you want to take us down that path?
Sure, absolutely. So once we get to around chapter 4 of the book, the argument revolves around veil of ignorance. So we ask the reader to imagine that they take a pill, which temporarily erases all memories about who they are, where they live, who their parents are, what skin color they have, which gods they worship, how much money they have, and so on. So you're truly behind a veil where you don't know anything about who you are in the world. And then we ask, behind that veil, not knowing which person you might be when you reemerge out into the world, would you prefer that Bitcoin is out there or not? Would you prefer a world with Bitcoin, which is much like ours, or a world without Bitcoin, where Bitcoin and everything like it has been erased from existence? Now, the veil has some predecessors in the history of philosophy. As you mentioned, the most famous is from John Rawls. He calls his not only the veil of ignorance, but the original position, like you mentioned, Zach. And before Rawls, there are people like Hume and Kant who imagines similar kinds of philosophical devices. But we drew inspiration less from Rawls and more from a Hungarian philosopher named John Harsanyi, who had a couple of papers about 15 years before Rawls's theory of justice in the early mid 50s. And Harsanyi is a utilitarian, and he has a way to mathematically calculate which world you would prefer for certain kinds of policy choices. Basically, the idea is that you have an equal chance of being anyone in the world, and whichever way the world goes. And then if the world goes one way, you can assign how pleased or satisfied or happy you'd be for any such person. And then if the world goes the other way, you also have a measure on how pleased or happy you would be on any particular person in the second world. And then you can add up to see which world has the best overall welfare or utility. And then you choose the world with the most expected utility. And so we do something similar, drawing from Harsanyi, with just a slight tweak. And that slight tweak comes from a Princeton philosopher named Laura Buchak. It especially relates to our relation to risk. So even if one world is much better than the other, the satisfaction or happiness might be highly concentrated amongst maybe even 10 people. But then you'd have a really high risk of being an unhappy person, even though the world overall has more utility. So we take Buchak's revision of Harsanyi's veil of ignorance to heart, and we say, look, between these two worlds, just these two worlds, one with Bitcoin and one without, which would you prefer to go into? And we found Harsanyi after I had a discussion with my brother, because we had already been talking about using a veil of ignorance amongst the three of ourselves, Andrew and Brad. And probably the inspiration for that, if I remember correctly, is that Nick Carter at some point had mentioned that Bitcoin would be the kind of money that you would choose if you were behind a veil of ignorance. And I thought that was a really interesting idea. And so I read a bunch of Rawls, and I thought, that has a lot of theoretical baggage. Rawls in particular accepts something called the maximum principle, where you're supposed to choose policies which would make the least well off the best well off. So you want a much higher floor. And there are all kinds of principles that lead them to this, principles about fairness and justice that not everyone might accept. And what we wanted to do is write a book where we had as little ideological baggage as possible. So I asked my brother, is there another way that we can do this? And my brother, who's also a professional philosopher, said, you need to read Harsanyi. And so that's why we tackled the veil of ignorance through the lens of Harsanyi.
I love that. Yeah, I don't know if the audience today is wanting to go down the philosophy rabbit hole as much as I do, but maybe to just kind of hang around on that topic a little bit longer. What does the ABC collective and probably kick it to Brad here. What do we make of the sort of utilitarian worldview, the Harsanyi worldview, maybe a Kant worldview? How do we kind of arrive where we are? What are the pros and cons of each of those?
Like Andrew said, we tried not to bring in a whole lot of political assumptions. We also tried to not bring in a whole lot of philosophical assumptions either. So if you're arguing for Bitcoin from a utilitarian perspective, then many people will say, oh, I'm not a utilitarian, therefore I'm not interested in the argument. Or if you try to argue for it from a Kantian deontological perspective, they'll say the same thing. So We really liked the framework that was provided, how much you could know about the world. We wanted you to basically be able to know everything. You're not starting over. The world is exactly as it is. The trees are where they are, and the people and the relations between all the people and all that stuff. What was important, and that's important for us because these people actually exist, and a lot of them are using Bitcoin. So we wanted to make sure that you could be one of those people, and not that you're starting the world and you want to start a world with Bitcoin or without Bitcoin. So really the important thing for us was to try to mitigate the biases that everyone brings to an evaluation of Bitcoin. The Bitcoin proponents bring their positive bias that they want Bitcoin to succeed. They've made investments maybe, or staked their professional reputation on it, as we did. And the people who are against it also have biases. Maybe they could have bought it and didn't. And so now they want to justify their decision. They want to have been right in the past. Or maybe they are harmed in some way by Bitcoin. Maybe their property values went up, or maybe they wanted to buy some property that they could no longer buy because of a Bitcoin mining facility or something like that. There's all sorts of ways in which Bitcoin affects people. But to evaluate Bitcoin from that perspective is to do it self-interestedly. And we didn't want to write a book where people would evaluate it self-interestedly. There are enough of those books. We wanted to argue that Bitcoin was good for the world. And that means overall, the world is better for having Bitcoin in it than the exact same world would be without Bitcoin. One way to figure that out is to think, if you could have been anyone in the world, would you want a Bitcoin world? And if you say yes, that means you think it's likely enough that you'd want Bitcoin, and the risks of not having Bitcoin around are high enough that you would opt for that. And you don't have to have any particular moral or ethical framework to think that. You could be a utilitarian and think it. You could be a Kantian. You could be a virtue theory. You could be have any take on morality. This is just sort of a fundamental hunch, or it goes beyond a hunch, because we do a lot of work to talk about who these people are and why they might want Bitcoin. But it's an evaluation prior to needing to come up with a moral or ethical theory.
Yeah, it's almost beautifully simplistic in a way. It's approachable, understandable, intuitive, I think, to a large degree. And I think, especially as you reach the latter chapters and you hear the different arguments about, what those considerations should look like, it becomes, much easier for you to weigh the costs and benefits. So switching gears a little bit, I think the chapter that really got me excited was the privacy in public chapter. And I think, privacy is definitely a big topic for everyone, not just Bitcoiners right now. What do one of y'all, maybe Andrew, what's kind of going on in that chapter? How are we kind of looking at privacy from a academic perspective? How is that fitting in with Bitcoin?
We begin by giving a case for the value of privacy. We think that privacy is both good in itself and good because of the things that it produces. And many people have made those kinds of cases before. So then we focus in particular on financial privacy. And this is easy to overlook, but it's in fact quite important to notice that privacy along any dimension is often subject to or protected only to the extent that your financial privacy is protected. So just think about what you've disclosed about yourself when you make a purchase or when you receive a payment. What you've done is you've shown the world what you actually value, because that's how we show what we value, is by giving up something of value for what we buy. So we show not just what we're up to, we show who we really are when we make those kinds of payments. So financial privacy really matters. Now, unfortunately, Chapter 6, the privacy chapter, has some bad news and some good news for Bitcoin. It might be the most pessimistic chapter about Bitcoin in the whole book. And in that respect, we just try to be realistic. because Bitcoin is a public ledger that anyone can read. So for any payment, you can tell the recipient, you can tell the sender, you can tell the amount. That's quite a bit right there already. Now, the good news is that Bitcoin is permissionless and doesn't have names. The doesn't have names part is important because though there's a cryptographic address associated with any payment, two of them, in fact, not necessarily a name. Second, and more importantly, the fact that Bitcoin's permissionless means that there are various privacy routing or smearing or obscuring tools that are available. So you can think of this as a PayPal where you're allowed to have 1,000 accounts and where you could spread your payments across the accounts and coordinate with others to smear your payments within the account and then pull it to another one and so on. That's basically what you can do with Bitcoin privacy tools. Now, unfortunately, we come back to the bad news again. These privacy tools for Bitcoin are severely limited. And at present, they don't quite get us up to the level of privacy that we might hope for with something like physical cash. So one of the few calls for actions that we have at the end of the book is for Bitcoiners to consider ways that Bitcoin might be upgraded or that its software might be modified to enhance privacy, because so much is at stake when it comes to financial privacy. So if you think that Bitcoin is going to grow and become a more important monetary network and that more is at stake because more people will be using it to receive, to save, or to send value, then you should be really paying attention and think about whether you might want to upgrade your own Bitcoin node to support privacy enhancing techniques.
Yeah, 100%. I think the thing to note in there is that, also the status quo that we live in today in the traditional financial system, even like not having your name attached to a transaction is to some degree, quite an upgrade. And even having access to tools that, can sort of add to your financial privacy as a, maybe an opt-in solution, that too is an upgrade. So again, I think it's important to be realistic as you are, and also to make the case of hey, let's look closely at the status quo. But just to dig back on the value of privacy discussion that was had at the start of that chapter, what's and maybe kick it back to you, Andrew. What's sort of the basis of privacy? Like what are we understanding as privacy in this scenario? How have maybe academics previously understood privacy, and what's the ABC privacy, definition or understanding?
Many academic definitions of privacy distinguish different kinds of information, and then they conceive of privacy as the hiddenness of that information. We actually think that most philosophers who've written about this have been wrong, and the person who was right was not a philosopher, but instead was a cypherpunk programmer, a cryptographer named Eric Hughes. And in his Cypherpunks Manifesto, written in the early 90s, he gives what we think is a much more useful and penetrating conception of privacy. So he says privacy is not anonymity, it's not hiding, it is rather the ability to selectively disclose yourself to the world. And we focus on that selectively, and maybe a useful word to use there is with consent. So privacy isn't being hidden, it's rather that when you're not hidden, when you're disclosed, you've consented to it. It's the ability to control how information is disclosed to the world. It's a kind of freedom. So freedom in general is valuable. It allows us to live life as we please, provided we don't harm others. That's just the fundamental case for liberalism, for the value of liberty. And privacy is a kind of liberty. It's the ability to live life with respect to your personal information and to only have it out there when you've consented to it, to have that information go out as you please rather than someone else pleases. Now, this is valuable in itself as a kind of freedom, and liberals in general will appreciate that, but it also makes possible other kinds of good things too. So think about the different kinds of relationships that you have. One hopes that, for example, your relationship with your doctor is very different from your relationship with your mother and with a professor and with a student and so on. You disclose different parts of yourself to different relations. And in fact, that's what makes them what they are and what makes them different and possible in the first place. And it's really privacy that's a heart of that. Now, if everything about you is already disclosed without your consent, if there's no hiding and no consent or selective disclosure of yourself to the world, then basically everybody relates to you the way that your therapist does. They know everything. And that's just not the way we prefer to relate to human beings. That's not what is conducive to our flourishing, to our unhappiness. So there's one example of how privacy can enable other goods. Here's a more political example. When there's a default assumption of privacy, it helps keep institutions in check. So institutions need to be kept in check include corporate authorities who might manipulate us or otherwise do things that we don't necessarily want them to do if they know more about us than we wanted to disclose. Second, think about prosecutors who might be overeager in the kinds of crimes or alleged crimes or non-crimes they might pursue with indictments and so on. The presumption or the default state of privacy where you've decided what to disclose keeps them in check. So they actually have to get a warrant before they go find that information about you and so on. So privacy isn't just good for us individually for our flourishing, it's also good for our institutions to make them more just and to behave.
Yeah. And speaking of that too, I think, another case that the three of you make is the human rights activists and dissident, sort of use of Bitcoin. And that, obviously might tie into the privacy conversation, but Craig, do you want to take us down that path a little bit and see if we can tie that into the privacy conversation?
Sure. If you're a journalist or whistleblower or some kind of activist, then you don't want the authoritarian in charge of the authoritarians in charge of the banking system to be able to cut you off and financially strangle you and excommunicate you so that you can't fund other activists or pay for what you need to pay for. And so as a result, financial privacy is not just important for us here or, people who are just trying to live ordinary lives across the globe, but for people who are seeking large social change, big social changes in other countries. And, so there's really like a two-sided coin here. There's privacy and then there's censorship resistance. So to the extent that you have more privacy, so that it's easier to hide where money is going, so that you can selectively disclose it rather than someone else, then it's easier for that money to find its recipient. To the extent that you lack privacy, it becomes more important that if someone can see where money is going, it's harder for them to stop it. So Bitcoin doesn't have perfect privacy, but it has censorship resistance in spades. But its censorship resistance is limited to the extent that people can see where money is flowing. So journalists and whistleblowers and other activists, they might use Bitcoin, but there's still a risk that the privacy is not good enough. Even so, Bitcoin does provide much more privacy and much more censorship resistance, especially under best practices, compared to traditional offerings.
Yeah, no, that's I think especially thinking about one of our primary audiences, as BPI as a organization is policymakers. I think that's one of the cases that resonates the most. And so I appreciate that was somewhat central to resistance money as well. All right. Gonna kick it off to you, Brad. Shifting gears a little bit, how's the reception been? I think the Bitcoiners have enjoyed reading it. I've seen it all over my Twitter feed. How have others? Maybe have you given it to your colleagues, journalists? How have others responded?
Well, I think perhaps the most important thing that we received was someone saying that the book is the style of raising arguments and responding to them was effective. We took a complicated technical financial asset and discussed it in ways that anyone can understand. We incorporated references to real people and real situations. It's scholarly but accessible. So that was really nice to hear. And, thanks to my dad for writing that to us. The reception among Bitcoiners, like you said, has obviously been really, really nice. But the reception among people who aren't Bitcoiners has also been positive. It hasn't received as much attention as we were perhaps hoping for, although there's always more time. But so far, nobody who has actually read the book, made their way all the way through it, has come out saying that it's not a good book. So they might disagree with aspects of it. They might not like how we treat certain topics. They might think that some of the objections that we address in chapter 11 are more successful than we give them credit for. But they've all recognized the sort of quality of the work. And, we state pretty near to the beginning, I think in chapter 1, that we just want people to consider the arguments. Think of us whatever you'd like. We're fellows with BPI. We use Bitcoin. We do have a stake in this, but we use Bitcoin largely because we think that the arguments in the book succeed. And if we wrote the book and we decided that the arguments didn't succeed, then we would stop using Bitcoin. It's not like we're forced to use Bitcoin. So yeah, I look forward to more critical people reading the book, people who have subject expertise in some of these areas, and telling us whether they think we got things wrong, say about mining and energy, or about privacy and censorship and things like that. Did we get any of the economics wrong? So far, we haven't gotten negative feedback of that kind, and so I'm hopeful that the book is actually that good.
Yeah, no, I might have to start, carrying some copies around campus and and offering it to folks and getting some feedback. But we got Andrew holding up some copies. Okay, what's next for ABC? I kick it to you, Andrew.
One of the most exciting events coming up later this year is that we'll have a chance to start promoting the book within the Academy. We've been invited to give a presentation at Princeton University, and that's a prestigious venue. And we hope that will be not just a little feather in the cap for us, but a chance to get some people to listen to our ideas and consider the arguments who otherwise might not have. The next big project we're working on is another book, and I'm afraid is another book that is about Bitcoin. Instead of a philosophical defense of Bitcoin, we're going to be thinking about something slightly more applied, which is principles that are useful for crafting coherent Bitcoin policy. And perhaps the guiding idea, and this is still in nascent or early stage of writing, but perhaps one of the most important guiding ideas is this idea of consistency. Now, there are a variety of other assets or networks or technologies that already get regulated or treated by policy in some way. And then Bitcoin comes along and it doesn't quite easily fit into some of those categories. And it's often treated accordingly in some what we think are unfair or inconsistent ways. So think, for example, about foreign currency in the United States. How is that treated in terms of tax? Well, for transactions up to $200 per day, it's treated as money, which means that you don't get capital gains tax if the foreign currency fluctuates a little bit from the time you bought it to the time you spent it. So we think that a fair application of that kind of principle to Bitcoin would be to give Bitcoin a similar de minimis exemption for spending. So that's a small example. There are more contentious and bigger examples having to do with energy use and Bitcoin's mining profile. So the first half of the book roughly will be to develop this broad, consistent, fair framework for developing policy about Bitcoin and stablecoins as well. And then the second half of the book, thinking about how to best apply that. Our goal here is not to do something super abstract or rarefied, but rather to have a concise handbook that's actually useful for policymakers to think seriously about this. So this isn't going to be a piece of pro-Bitcoin advocacy. It's more like, here's a new technology that we must think about clearly and carefully, and here's a tool to help you do so.
Yeah, that's sounds amazing. I'm looking forward to seeing that and seeing, what the responses to that look like. Craig, anything on the individual level coming up? Obviously working on the book together, but what's in store for y'all as individuals?
Sure. I myself have a couple of research articles that I'm working on. One's in collaboration with another BPI fellow, Josh Hendrickson, and this concerns certain ideas about how to use Bitcoin miners domiciled in the United States to censor blacklisted addresses on OFAC's specially designated nationals list, and the sort of economic arguments about whether this is feasible, whether it's feasible for non-compliant miners to continue to mine. So Josh and I hope to finish that paper around this month. I have another research article in collaboration with Will Luther about what we call the sour grapes bias. So, Bitcoin holders are biased because we hold Bitcoin. And so we're more inclined to, provide positive arguments for Bitcoin. But there's the flip side to this, which is that the people who never bought Bitcoin have lost the opportunity to benefit from Bitcoin's upside. And we think that just as people who hold Bitcoin should disclose their Bitcoin holdings, people who are especially negative about Bitcoin should disclose the lost opportunity and not benefiting from holding Bitcoin. So that's another paper. And then I'd like to work, we have plans to write another book on scams. So I have some friends at Arizona State University, an epistemologist and a social scientist. We would like to help people avoid scams, especially now that I think there are two things that can converge here, which kind of makes Bitcoin a bit dangerous for people. Bitcoin provides irreversible transactions. So if you get scammed and you end up sending money through a bank account or credit card, you could either have those transactions reversed or the credit card company will, in fact, maybe reimburse you. And that's just not possible with Bitcoin. And in addition, now that generative AI has made deepfakes possible, there's the opportunity for people to, call up, a son or a daughter, or a parent, and pretend to be a family member, and say, you need to send this certain money, and it might sound real, it might look real, and then you send them a Bitcoin, and that transaction is not reversible. So we'd like to provide concrete proposals for how people can avoid scams like this. So this is like an exercise in harm reduction. But there are also new things coming up for Andrew and Brad, not only individually, but together through the Bitcoin Research Institute at the University of Wyoming, which I'm sure they'd like to talk more about.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. We, published the book, and we feel like that sends a strong signal and hopefully will serve as kind of a magnet to draw people to do academic research on Bitcoin, that it can be done, it can be well received, it can be impactful. And, the Bitcoin Policy Summit brings together people from industry, it brings together human rights activists, it brings together academics, and we envision a academic workshop that will just do the academic side of that in Wyoming, that can connect researchers to each other, help get feedback on papers, start new projects, things like that. I think one of the things we're seeing is that while there have been some excellent academic work done on Bitcoin, BPI needs access to more of that to put in front of legislators who might be distrustful of industry folks, who they think are just trying to make money, or distrustful of lobbyists. And we think there's a place for academics to tell the truth about Bitcoin. And we need to do kind of more of that work together. So I think one of the things we've learned from working with BPI and being in the Slack, as Andrew mentioned, and chatting with Will and Josh and Margot and Troy and Matthew Ferranti and all these other people, is that there's real value in coming together and working on things together and having a community. And so we want to start doing some of these events in Wyoming.
Amazing. Yeah, I think we're all looking forward to seeing how that goes and hearing some reports. All right. That was everything I had slated, but I do want to give you all a chance for some final thoughts. So we'll go ABC here in order. How about that?
Thanks, Zach. Thanks for having us. And to whoever's watching this video, whether you're David or Grant or Renee or the other Zach, or perhaps some donor to BPI, thank you too. We couldn't do what we do without BPI. It's been tremendously helpful for us. Even, we're philosophy professors. So the fellowship, this money that we get in the side, it's meaningful to us. And people who donate to BPI are doing something significant to enable the work we do. So thank you. It's meaningful, and it means something to us too. We really appreciate that.
I have felt an incredible amount of support from day one, from David and Grant and Stephen, and now you, Zach, and Renee. And it seems like the Bitcoin Policy Institute is doing more things each year and doing them better and having more of an impact and growing. And so it's cool to have gotten in on the ground floor, and it's cool to still be here and still be working with you all.
I'm incredibly grateful for BPI. I get to do research that I wouldn't otherwise be able to do, and give talks that I otherwise wouldn't be able to give talks for. And BPI also gives us space to collaborate, to meet up so that we can collaborate in person that otherwise wouldn't be possible. And you can't always tell that an organization is healthy from the outside. But BPI is an incredibly healthy organization. The leadership is strong. It's, and I'm very proud to be a part of it. Not only under David and Grant's leadership, but alongside the other fellows. So I couldn't be more grateful and couldn't be more proud to be a fellow.
Amazing. Thank you all so much, for everything too. I think Resistance Money as a book is truly a gift, for all of us in Bitcoin and, maybe everyone more broadly. So thank you for that. And thank you for joining me today. That's going to do it. So thank you again.
Thanks, Zach.